Welcome back to AP World History. We're talking about World War II, its causes, uh, conditions during the war, and conditions in the world after World War II is concluded. Uh, Japan is going to surrender unconditionally in 1945, as did Germany. Italy was actually knocked out of the war early on in 1943, but the Germans will occupy northern Italy until the end of the war. Um, One of the first organizations that is created is the United Nations. We talked a little bit about that last time. It's an institution that was put together to provide for negotiations for international disputes, try to avert war. Unfortunately, many of the things that the UN was originally founded on has been somewhat of a failure, as was the League of Nations. This period also will usher in what we call the Cold War, and this will be the United States primarily against the Soviet Union. Each side will have their allies. And this war will go on for a number of years. Actually, the Cold War comes to the end in the late 1990s. The Berlin Wall will come down. There'll be reunification of East Germany and West Germany. The satellite countries in the Warsaw Pact will become independent nations, and the Soviets will abandon the communist model. Um, Before the war was over, there were a couple of conferences, the Yalta Conference between the big three, which was Stalin, FDR, and Winston Churchill, and they will agree that Germany will be divided up into four zones. Germany, its capital, Berlin, will be divided into four zones controlled by the French, the United States, Great Britain, and Soviet Union. Uh, Many of the Eastern Bloc nations will go under the authority or the domination of the Soviet Union: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. Uh, and the United States and the Soviet Union, although allies during World War II, will become enemies after the war. There was something called the Berlin Airlift. This is going to take place in 1948. The Soviets will close off the corridor to go to Berlin, and the United States and her allies will airlift food and materials to help West Berlin survive. And eventually the airlift will succeed. Stalin will lift the blockade of this corridor. Many people thought that the Soviet Union and the United States might go to war, World War III, over this particular incident. Um, the Soviet Union um, fears Germany. They want her to be weakened so that they will not have to fight another war with her. One of the things that precipitated this blockade of West Berlin was the fact that uh, France, United States, Great Britain agreed that West Germany would be created, and the Soviet Union was against that. We talked briefly about the Atlantic Charter, 1941. This is just prior to the United States entering the war, and Great Britain and the United States agreeing on how the world would look after the war, the fact that we would continue to aid Great Britain. Great Britain desperately wants the United States to enter into the war on her side. The seedbed for the United Nations was laid during this Atlantic Charting Movement or Charter Agreement signed off the coast of Canada. Winning independence in South Asia. Certainly after the war, the profile of the world is going to change. The old order is out, a new order is in. The colonial powers that dominated Africa and Asia are going to come to an end. Probably one of the last nations to leave is going to be France, and this is going to be in about 1954. But India will become an independent nation. Many of the nations that were under colonial rule in Africa will become their own nations. And so this period of imperialism is going to pass away. The Indian movement, the nationalists, Indian National Congress, led by Gandhi, is going to keep pushing for independence from Great Britain. This decolonization begins in 1945, and it will extend again to about in the 1950s. Eventually, the British will divide the Indian territory into India, East and West Pakistan, primarily to accommodate the Hindus and also the Muslims. During this partition, about 1 million people are going to be killed. Gandhi is going to preach nonviolence. He's going to eventually be assassinated. Others will take his place. The West Pakistan is what we call Pakistan today. East Pakistan will originally they were part of the same country, but will divide. But this is primarily Muslims. There was a lot of refugees that went from different parts of India into areas that accommodated their religion. Muslims against Sikhs, and Hindus against the Muslims. Muslims and the Hindus historically had never gotten along too well. Between 1956 and 1960, the French colonies, Senegal, Ivory Coast, this is in Africa, will gain their independence. By 1960, all of France's West African colonies had been independent. Belgium gave up her colony in Congo in 1960. So these countries will become their own countries and break away from colonial rule, both in Asia and in Africa. The struggle for settler colonies, certainly there's going to be some problems between the white minority and the indigenous populations in those areas when decolonization comes about. The European settlers were reluctant to turn over political control to the African majorities. Many of the African leaders will turn to violence and revolution to gain dominance. In Kenya, the Nationalist Party, the Kenyan African Union, formed the Land Freedom Army in the 1950s and used terror and guerrillas tactics to fight the British. Eventually, Kenya will receive its independence in 1963. The persistence of the white supremacy, this is going to be very notable in South Africa. The Afrikaners, which were the Dutch descendants, had no option to return to Europe. They consider South Africa their homeland. They are a minority. The black population is a majority, the people of color. Anyway, they wanted to win a complete independence from Great Britain, which came about without violence in 1961. But they will continue a racist regime where blacks are considered second-class citizens, and they won't have the same rights as the white population in South Africa. This was called apartheid in South Africa, where the whites dominated the government and the economy, and basically the people of color, were subordinate to the white population. Other places in the Middle East, we go back to the Balfour Declaration. during World War I, calling for a Jewish homeland. Certainly, there's going to be problems between the Jewish population and the Arab population in the Middle East, and it still goes on today. When we talk about Zionists, we're talking about those who wanted a Jewish homeland founded in Palestine, which is now Israel. In 1948, the UN approved the partition of Palestine into the Arab and the Jewish countries. The area of Palestine and Israel continue to be a real thorn in the sight of world peace today. And we'll stop there. And we'll talk to you in the future.